Good morning, Tricia.
Morning.
How are you?
Good.
I'd like to welcome you to the main National Park Service office here in Mariposa. This is our office for Yosemite National Park, and it's a pleasure to be interviewed by you. And let's just go ahead and start having that conversation.
Okie dokie. So I have several questions for you.
Okay.
So first, tell me about yourself, Shelton.
Well, my name is Shelton Johnson. I've worked as a park ranger here in Yosemite for the last 23 years, and I've worked for the agency for over 30 years. Most of my experience has been here in Yosemite, but I also worked in Great Basin National Park, which is Nevada's only national park. Worked there for about a year and a half, worked in Washington, D.C. for about a year and a half. And then I began in Yellowstone. That's where the park idea to a great degree began. And I worked in Yellowstone for about 7 years. But here is my home and my favorite place.
Excuse me. So where are you from originally?
I'm originally from Detroit, and when I say Detroit, I don't mean the suburbs of Detroit or rural, some rural area surrounding Detroit. I'm from the inner city. I grew up near U of D College, Marygrove College. So basically it was inner city, 60s and 70s,
Right.
That's when I grew up. It was a great childhood, but it was a challenging childhood because there was a lot of crime. But there was also a lot of compassion and friendships and family and all those good things. So it was a mixed bag, but you know, when you have a good family and strong parents, you can deal with the outside world if the interior world, the internal world, is supportive. And it was a very supportive structure with my mom and my dad, my grandparents and my brother.
Right. That's nice. When you went to college, well, where did you go to college and what did you study?
I went to college initially in Detroit. I went to Wayne State University, a public school in Detroit, Michigan. I was there for about a year, and then I transferred to the University of Michigan to Ann Arbor. My undergraduate degree is in English literature, or as my father put it, unemployment. And my dad was quite perceptive. And after I graduated with a BA in English Lit, I joined the Peace Corps, served as a 7th grade English teacher in Liberia, West Africa. I was there for only a few months because I became quite ill. Then I came back, went to graduate school, majored in poetry. Obviously, I was still disappointing my father, but I attended the MFA program in creative writing at the University of Michigan. So it was a very prestigious program. I was happy about that. Did that for about a year, took a summer off in Yellowstone as a concession employee, and essentially I never left. Once I was in Yellowstone, Yellowstone was equally within me. And I just could not leave Montana. I mean, it sounds like the beginning of a blues song. I just couldn't leave Montana. And I fell in love with the environment, fell in love with being in the Rockies. And that mountain experience is a very powerful one for me because I'm a military kid. I grew up in Detroit, but I also grew up from Detroit, we moved to California, and then California, we moved to Germany. From Germany, we moved to England. From England, we moved to Kansas City, and then back to Detroit. So my earliest childhood memories are of Germany, of the Bavarian Alps, the Black Forest, and that was my first experience of wilderness, or at least wildness, in the Bavarian Alps. And to some degree, that's the main reason why we're having a conversation today, because I never left the mountains from that moment in Germany, between my mom and my dad, with a shadowy gulf or abyss beneath me and clouds floating along thousands of feet beneath me, and looking up and seeing these banners of snow unfurling from the mountains surrounding us. I was halfway between here and heaven, and I never lost the memory of that experience. And it really kind of kept me sane when we moved back to Detroit, because there's a marked difference between Detroit and Bavaria. There's usually not comparisons ever made between Bavaria and Detroit. And I would say that that's the main reason why I'm a park ranger, is because I had that baptism, if you will, in the mountains, but not even in the United States, in the mountains of Bavaria and Germany.
I need to go sometime.
Yeah,
That sounds beautiful.
Yeah, it's also, that area is also known as Berchtesgaden, and Berchtesgaden is one of my earliest memories, as I stated, and that's a sister park now to Yosemite. So it's kind of a full circle.
What got you into the great outdoors?
Well, as I said, it was primarily that experience of being in Bavaria, because the whole time I was growing up in Detroit in the 60s and 70s, I mean, I lived next door to the parents of Norman Whitfield, who wrote Papa Was a Rolling Stone and I Heard It Through the Grapevine. And I remember him showing up to visit his parents in his red Jaguar. And in the late 60s, a red Jaguar driven by a black man, that's going to really stand out.
Right.
You know? But he was a Motown executive and a songwriter. He's in the Hall of Fame, Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
Right.
And I didn't know what he did at first, but all I knew is whatever he did, I wanted to do that because he had money, looked good, he had this beautiful car. And there were trips, family trips, to Belle Isle, this kind of county park that's in the Detroit area. And it just kind of kept those things like that, those trips with my grandparents to Belle Isle, kept that spark of that memory of being in Germany. But that's the key thing. I never forgot being in Germany. Being in Germany stayed with me the whole time I was in Detroit because I was the only person that I knew who could close his eyes and see the Bavarian Alps from a memory, not from watching television, not from seeing it in a movie, but this firsthand felt experience of being in the mountains. It was such a powerful experience when I was a kid that I never forgot it. And I would say that that's why I'm a ranger. I'm a ranger because I wanted to reconnect with that early childhood experience of being in the mountains.
How did your parents feel about your career choice?
Well, my dad wanted me to be a lawyer. He wanted me to be a professional. And I wanted to make my dad happy. He was a career military person. He was the son of sharecroppers, grew up in Spartanburg, South Carolina. He grew up during the height of Jim Crow, separate and very much unequal. He basically grew up in an environment where my grandfather told him that if he did not leave South Carolina, that he would find him hanging from a tree. Because my dad was a strong, very strong man. And if he didn't see something that agreed with him, he'd speak up. He'd speak out. But for a black man to speak up and speak out in South Carolina in the 30s, that very, very easily could become a dead man. And so my grandfather told my dad that if he didn't leave the South, like as I said before, he would be killed. And so my dad actually joined the Army for safety, for security. I mean, most people don't join the military as a refuge, to a place that will make them feel safe. But it was safer for my dad to be in the infantry in Korea than to be a strong African-American man in South Carolina in the 1930s.
Wow.
So my dad is the model of the Buffalo Soldier character that I portray. So I tell that story to some degree as a way of saying thank you to not just my father, but to his generation. My dad was a Korean War vet and a Vietnam vet. So a lot of those soldiers, many of them, never received a proper welcome back home. They received protests, they received people who were yelling at them and all this other stuff. And I think that whenever a veteran I respect veterans, I respect people men and women who serve their country and risk their lives, and some of them lost their lives. And I come from a fairly fortunate family in that my father served in the Army and the Air Force. My brother served in the Navy in Iraq and during the Persian Gulf War. They both came back. And a lot of folks didn't have that experience, and so I'm pretty lucky. But I'm a military kid.
Yeah.
And so telling the Buffalo Soldier story was easy for me, or easier because I felt a kinship with those soldiers who served in Yosemite and Sequoia 100 years ago. I didn't see them as strangers. I saw them as relations. I saw them as men that could have been my father had my father been born 50 years earlier.
It's funny you say that because I actually did research on the Buffalo Soldier, a lot of research, and I was watching a broadcast of, they call them the Forgotten Buffalo Soldiers. And one Buffalo Soldier, and you had said that your father was growing up in the time of the Jim Crow laws, one Buffalo Soldier had said, whites and blacks at the time were fighting the same fight but for different reasons.
Mm-hmm.
And a Buffalo Soldier, whose name I can't remember, had stated that white people were fighting to stay on top, but black people were fighting to gain the same rights as them back at home. So,
right.
Would you say that is definitely something your father was doing in the 30s?
Yeah, I usually put it this way, that to some degree, the civil rights movement began in the military. I mean, Crispus Attucks was the first person to fall in the Revolutionary War, and he was African American. And from the Revolutionary War to all the wars since, African Americans essentially have been fighting for their own freedom and for their right to be treated as first-class citizens, full citizens of the United States. And that was the promise of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution. The 13th Amendment ended slavery, supposedly. There was loopholes there.
Right.
The 14th Amendment granted full citizenship to African Americans. And the 15th Amendment granted African Americans the right to vote. But there are all these little hooks and all these pitfalls in there, because if you were in the South, south of the Mason-Dixon, and you tried to vote, well, there were ways of keeping you from voting. There were poll taxes that were in place. And if you didn't have the money to pay the poll tax, then you couldn't vote. And if for some bizarre reason you had the money to pay the poll tax, then there was outright aggression, people telling you you can't vote. So you had the poll tax, you had the literacy tests, and the literacy tests were different for African Americans than they were for European Americans. Basically, you had to be a lawyer to pass the literacy test, and then you have to have the money to pay the poll tax. Then you had to deal with outright intimidation at the polling place. So those are all ways of disenfranchising African Americans and undercutting the passage of those amendments to the Constitution, which is what led to some degree, the Civil Rights Movement happening in the 50s and 60s. There wouldn't really have been a need for a civil rights movement if those amendments to the Constitution had been held by all people. Like if they said, yes, let's follow this to the letter. But that didn't happen. And that's why Martin Luther King said what he said in his I Have a Dream speech about that we've come here to collect a check or chit. Like in other words, there was a promissory note that was given with those amendments and it was never kept. And that was the whole point of everything leading to the March on Washington. So for me, that march didn't just begin, a lot of it to some degree began in the rural South, but it began with these soldiers, the soldiers that preceded them that fought in all of America's wars. Because when people ask me what makes the Buffalo Soldier story so interesting and challenging, is that they were always fighting on two fronts. They were always fighting the enemy that was the stated foe, the combatants, but they were also fighting the people that they were fighting for. They were fighting the prejudice that existed within the military, where many European American officers refused to serve with Buffalo Soldier regiments. They refused to serve with the 24th or 25th Regiments of Infantry. They refused to serve with the 9th and 10th Regiments of Cavalry that were all formed after 1866. And they refused that because they thought it would be beneath them to serve with this lesser regiment. And that was the case with George Armstrong Custer. Custer thought it was beneath him to serve with any of these black regiments. And, well, to some degree, that's one of the only instances that I'm aware of where someone's hatred and bigotry worked in favor of African Americans, because then it was the 7th Cavalry at Little Bighorn and not the 9th or the 10th Regiments of Cavalry. So it was a very challenging world they lived in, that they were always fighting on two fronts. The people that were the combatants they were against, but then the people around them who felt they weren't good enough to be soldiers. So essentially, they were fighting for the right to be perceived and treated as human beings.
Excuse me. So as a park ranger, what would you say? Well, first of all, do you remember your job interview? And why did you pick so many national parks? Were there other jobs or other options you wanted to do?
My first experience in the national parks in the States was Yellowstone. So, I was in Yellowstone for a while. I got this promotion into this program called the Intake Training Program. They could send you anywhere in the United States. They sent me to D.C., to urban D.C., to Anacostia. And I would have been fine if I'd been there for a few months, but they wanted me to be there for 2 or 3 years, and that was different from what I was told. So to make a long story short, I left Southeast D.C., I left Anacostia, because I felt that I could make a greater contribution working in a wilderness park. My first experience in a national park in the United States was Yellowstone, and I fell in love, as I said, with Yellowstone. I was the only African-American ranger when I was in Yellowstone. And I felt that I had a role there. I felt that I needed to make that statement, and I made that statement whenever I put that uniform on. Just when you put your uniform on, you're making a statement that this is a pathway that African Americans can follow, that we can make a contribution to the protection of public lands. And that's not a path that many people of color have taken, but more of us will continue to take that path. But it's a strange thing to be this late in the game and yet be a pioneer. I'm a pioneer, you're a pioneer. The gentleman who's right there that no one can see, that is invisible, he's a pioneer. And it's important to be pioneers because you're pushing that door open, but it's also challenging to be a pioneer because, as we all know, pioneers do not have it easy. If you want to have it easy, don't be a pioneer.
Right.
Because if you look at all the immigrants, whether they were European American, whether they were African American, they were all immigrants to some degree. When you look at them, they had a very difficult life, and the children had very difficult lives because they were in wilderness and they were trying to make their way in a world that was often very unforgiving. So, in a cultural sense, communities of color that choose a path in working in America's public lands or in state parks are pioneers, because those doors were not always open to us.
So, what would you say on the job? Do you have any hard aspects of your job or struggles or challenges you faced as the only African American park ranger?
Not particularly, because the thing is, when I was starting out, there were always some challenges. I remember when I was stepping outside of the Mammoth Visitor Center in Yellowstone National Park, and I was in the shadows a bit, and there was this woman coming up. She saw my uniform, but I was in the shadows. She couldn't really see my face very clearly. And so she said, "Excuse me, Ranger." And then I stepped out into the light, and she looked at me, and she went, "Oh, maybe you don't know." And I looked at her and said, "Maybe I don't know what?" "Well, I have a question." I said, "Well, ma'am, how can I help you? What's your question?" She said, "Those animals that we're seeing, are they deer or are they elk?" And I said, "Well, ma'am, they're actually in the deer family, and they're elk. Elks are members of the deer family." "Oh, okay. All right, well, thank you." It was a very simple question.
Right.
But because she saw someone that she was not expecting to see, there are very few movies that show African Americans that work for the Fish and Wildlife Service, or the BLM, or the Forest Service, or the National Park Service, or the Army Corps of Engineers, or what have you. So when you look at these land management agencies and their history, there's a sociological component to it, a cultural component to it in the private sector. And inner city kids do not normally see themselves reflected when they see a Forest Service ranger or a BLM ranger. And so they don't necessarily think that that's something that they can pursue because they haven't seen it in popular culture. There have not been enough movies about Forest Service, BLM, Park Service, and people of color.
Exactly.
Yeah, so that's what makes it challenging.
Right. When did you notice that there was a lack of African American within natural or wild spaces, and how do you feel about the low demographics of that?
Well, I first noticed it my first season as a concession employee in Yellowstone National Park. I remember I went out with this young woman who was working at a supermarket in West Yellowstone, Montana. She was African American. And if you're African American, you really stand out in West Yellowstone, Montana, that part of the country. And we took a road trip right into the park, and we're walking around Norris Geyser Basin, which is the most active geyser basin in the park. And she was just walking around. She was looking at all these people around her. There were people from France and Belgium and Germany and England and everywhere, but very few people of color. And she was walking around. She was saying, "Where are all the black people? Where are the black people? This is so beautiful. This is amazing. Where are the black people at? Where are all the black people? They should be here." And that was 30 years ago, and I can still clearly see her, and I can hear her voice, and I can hear the questioning in her voice, but I can also hear the pain in her voice. To be in the presence of such beauty around her, but not to see members of her own community enjoying that beauty, even though African Americans are entitled and own these places as much as anyone else. And that's when I think of that moment, walking around the Norris Geyser Basin with her. And I had already experienced that myself. Obviously I had already been there, but it's just that hearing someone else who looked like me saying what I had never spoken into the air, that was a very powerful thing for me, because it just made me, it wasn't just me and lost in my own thoughts thinking, "God, there sure are not a lot of black people around here."
Right.
It was another African American saying, "Where are they?" With this combination of shock and surprise and sadness. And yet it's like it was this thought of, and this was the language that wasn't spoken. How is it it that that person from Denmark, and that person from Sweden, and that person from Poland, and that person from the Czech Republic, how is it that they know about this, and they're here, and people in my own community in Chicago, in Detroit, in New York, in Miami, how come they're not here? It's that was the tension that was there. And that, to some degree, is the result that the marketing was never marketed towards communities of color in the 60s and 70s, and let alone in the 50s and 40s and 30s. We were never a target of that outreach. And with the Park Service, it really didn't begin until the presidency of John Kennedy. Under John Kennedy, you had Stuart Udall was Secretary of the Interior, George Hartsog, the third great director of the National Park Service. George Hartsog, he was basically tasked with increasing the role, or not just increase the role, but bringing in more women and bringing in more communities of color. That's how long the Park Service has really been engaged in bringing in communities of color, since the 60s. And not much has really changed. I mean, things have gotten better. I mean, we had Bob Stanton, the first African-American director of the National Park Service. There are African-Americans now who are superintendents. And of course, Bob Stanton was the first African-American superintendent in the National Park Service since Charles Young was the acting military superintendent of Sequoia National Park in 1903. So from 1903 to the 1960s, that was the gulf between African-American superintendents of the national park. And it's changing.
Yeah.
And it is getting better.
Yes.
It is getting better. But it's just that it's the progress is slow. It's kind of like walking to the top of a mountain. The closer you get, the harder it becomes.
That's so true. Do you believe, okay, so I'm trying to find a right way to word this, like not saying it's a myth, or I put it down as, do you believe it's true that African Americans are uninterested in nature? But more, I feel as if we have, maybe not as much as we should, but I'm trying, other people are trying, like organizations like Outdoor Afro, for instance, they're really getting the target audiences. But what do you think is the reason for the uninterest, or if any uninterest?
Well, it's complicated. It's the sort of thing that can't be really reduced to a soundbite, but it has everything to do with history. Not only the history of African Americans within the United States, but the specific history of African Americans within their own communities and within their own households. If you come from a household where your parents love fishing, your parents love going for hikes out in the woods, then there's a high likelihood you're going to go for a hike out in the woods. There's the high likelihood you're going to learn how to fish or how to hunt. And I've met African Americans who hunt. I've met African Americans who know all about wildlife and livestock. Like, for example, I worked at Oxon Hill Farm in Oxon Hill, Maryland as a National Park Ranger. I drove a tractor, I sloughed the pigs, I milked the cows. I tried never to reverse those two and get them mixed up. And my job was to talk about the influence of the Industrial Revolution on 19th century agriculture in the United States. And the two people who knew the most about the livestock and about all the farm equipment and about farming itself were two African American men who had grown up on farms in like Virginia. Yeah. They knew the most about it. And this is what I'm saying. There is an uncomfortable relationship that African Americans have with rural life, because there was a stigma associated with it, because for such a long period of time, all we could do was farm. And before that, it was sharecropping. And before it was sharecropping, it was slavery. So there's a conduit that connects to this negativity that's associated with the whole experience of being enslaved. And so that's why I always try to communicate. And when you look at African American history, you're looking at the period of enslavement. But during the period of enslavement, our perception of wildness was a positive, because you'd escape from the plantation. You disembark following the drinking gourd. You're going north following the North Star. And wilderness at that point was a positive. It was fraught with peril. But no one was beating you at that point. No one was you weren't being whipped. You were out there under the stars, and nature was around you, and it was a balm. It was a salve. Okay? But post-Reconstruction, when we were granted these new rights, we became an economic threat to a lot of the European Americans that were around us. So now we had to be reminded of our real place in society, and that was the rise of the KKK. And so what I'm saying is, for many African Americans, we've forgotten that earlier relationship with the wild when, like when it was more of a positive thing, because that connected with what it means to be African. We never asked that question. How is it that someone or people of African descent who on the west coast of Africa had an innate emotional, psychological connection with the earth, the land of our ancestors, how can we move from that in just a few hundred years to, I'm not going out there, I'm not going out in the mountains, I'm not going out, how do we make that shift? And it has everything to do with history. When I served in the Peace Corps, all of my students had this innate connection with the land. And when I asked them about what's that bird or what's that animal, they knew it. They knew the name of that bird, they knew the name of that animal. Usually it was in their own language. It was Kru, or Pele, or Bassa, Mandinka, but they didn't know it necessarily in English. Oh, I don't know how to say this in English, but in the language of my people, it is Uzma, or whatever it was, you know. And I remember just thinking, when I was growing up in Detroit, no one told me, is that an elm tree? What kind of deciduous tree is that? That looks like a conifer. I didn't even know conifer. I didn't know the word conifer. No one explained that because we've lost this fluency with the land, moving from 400 years of a journey from Africa to the New World. That's one of the things that were lost, but not completely lost, because some African Americans still know that stuff in the South, you know, that live in rural areas. So all of that is part of what the answer of what you're saying. It's 400 years of a gradual disconnection. And so when you're fighting 400 years of an evolving disconnect, you can't have an evolving connection like that. It takes time. And more than anything else, it takes immersion. It takes getting inner city kids from urban environments and taking them out into these spaces.
So, as I've told you before, I've read your book, Gloryland, and it's definitely one of my top 5. It's a really good book. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Well, Gloryland is a historical novel. It was sparked by my research of the African American military history in Yosemite and Sequoia. Because and it was mostly primary research, most of the history was not in history books, it was all in primary documentation. So correspondence, letters, military reports, that's where it was housed. In the research library in Yosemite, the research library in Sequoia, and at the Presidio of San Francisco. So anyway, the key thing is this. I hired a researcher who secured for me the muster rolls, the listing of all the names of all the soldiers who were African American who served in Yosemite and Sequoia. Before I received those muster rolls, I had like 5 or 6 names. And I didn't even know when I started how many soldiers had served in both parks. I didn't know when we started which soldiers belonging to which regiments of the Army served in the park. I didn't know how long they served in the park. I just knew that there was a photograph showing soldiers in Yosemite. So I had to go back from that and find out all the details of it. And so when I received the muster rolls, the thing that I noticed, and this goes back to the early part of the conversation, is that just about every single soldier that served in Yosemite and Sequoia was from the South. Because before 1900, almost all African Americans lived in the South because of slavery. So I'm looking down that list and I'm saying Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas, Florida. And I'm realizing that these were guys who are Southerners, because that's where most African Americans actually lived. And that's when I realized that my father's story was their story with a difference of about 50 years. My father was from South Carolina. I saw soldiers that were from South Carolina, that were from Georgia, that were from Kentucky. And so the thought that I had was this: how do you get from Texas, how do you get from Mississippi to the Range of Light, to the Sierra Nevada? What's the gulf in between? They were growing up in a world where they only knew 10 miles in that direction, 10 miles in that direction, 15, 20 miles in that direction. That was their world. So how do you take a kid from that kind of setting and then they enlist? Or where did they enlist? Maybe they enlisted in Nebraska. Maybe they were part of the Great Migration and they walked after the Civil War. They walked from Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia, Arkansas, and they walked to the north, and that's where they enlisted. But I see where they were enlisting all across the country, and I realized that their story was also my father's story. And I realized that was a very powerful thing, because for me, it wasn't this distant kind of history that you couldn't connect. It wasn't cold. It was my family. And when I looked at those soldiers, I just remember thinking, every face I looked at in that photograph showing the 5 guys on horseback, that's now a poster, I said, that could have been my great-great-grandfather. That could have been my great-great-grand-uncle. You know, that's my cousin right there. And I realized that their story was my story. And my story was theirs.
So, excuse me, you call it a pioneer, being a pioneer. I don't know what other places call it, but where I'm from in Sac State, they call me a path breaker.
Mm-hmm.
How does it feel, personally, actually, being a path breaker? You've even said being a pioneer is a struggle, and if you don't want to do it, then do something else. What keeps you going? What keeps you as a pioneer? Do you ever feel like, or have you ever felt like you've lost the connection, or was there ever a time where you're like, I don't want to do this? Or do you get tired of it?
I get tired. I get tired. I suffer from fatigue.
Yeah.
I suffer and have suffered from exhaustion. But the thing that keeps me going is the recognition that my absolute worst day on the job was a good day for the 9th Cavalry. That there's a whole different level of trauma. There's a whole different level of psychological attack compared to what they had to deal with. So I have it made. I've got it easy. I live with the legacy of the Civil Rights Movement. I'm following in the shadow of Martin Luther King and Medgar Evers and Shirley Chisholm and all of those folks. You know, they're the true trailblazers. They're the ones that really made that path. Charles Young made that path. Benjamin Davis made that path. Senior and junior made that path. All the people who preceded me have made that journey easier for me. So I don't think I have the right to feel sorry for myself or to feel uncomfortable, because I've got it made compared to what they had to deal with. So whenever I'm thinking, oh, I don't know if I can keep doing this, again, I don't know if I have to stand, I'm getting tired of talking about Buffalo Soldiers. It was a long time ago. I want to move forward. Every time I get there, I just think of Charles Young. I think of that photograph of him, and he's got it signed for race and country, that he was not just fighting for his own country that had not fully accepted him and his people. He was fighting for his own people, for the right to be treated as full citizens of this country. So comparing what I'm dealing with to what Charles Young dealt with 100 years ago, that's nothing to complain about.
Right.
Much of the victory that I'm experiencing, the success that I've experienced, is because of the work of those who preceded me. And I've never lost sight of that. So, yeah, I'm a pioneer, but it's easy compared to what they had to deal with.
What would you say is one of your greatest accomplishments?
I'm sorry?
What would you say is one of your greatest accomplishments?
Well, I would say my greatest accomplishment was my collaboration with Ken Burns and Dayton Duncan on the National Parks, America's Best Idea, the PBS film. That was my greatest accomplishment, because it was also the greatest responsibility that I've had in terms of reaching a large group of people. Because this film's reached regularly tens of millions of people. So I didn't want to mess up. I didn't want to have that opportunity squandered. Because that door is not always there. And that's why always when I'm talking to young people, I always say that success is the intersection of preparation and opportunity. And the only thing that you can control is the preparation. The opportunity may show up when you're least expecting it. But the preparation is what you do have control over. So when you have that opportunity and it's right there, it's your responsibility to be at your best and do the best that you can. And that's what I set for myself when I was being interviewed by Ken Burns. I knew that if I could get the Buffalo Soldier story in that film, it would change everything. Because first, it would stamp like when you get something in the grocery store, it has a life expectancy,
Yes.
or this is good for 1 year, and then it goes. And so, for the whole time I've been working with this Buffalo Soldier story, I was always hyper-conscious of the fragility of the story, that it could disappear again. It's disappeared twice before in Yosemite. You know, Kenneth Noel was a ranger in Yosemite in the 70s. He told the story, then it disappeared. Althea Roberson was a ranger in the 80s, and she told the story of the Buffalo Soldiers, and again, it wasn't that well known. But they worked hard on that, and so I realized what could I do that was different, and that was engaging the media, using the media as a means of amplifying the story, and that's to some degree why I've been more successful, or the story has become more successful, is because I've intentionally engaged the media every chance I could.
And in all your works of doing this, you said you've been doing it for like over 20 years?
Yeah. Well, put it this way, I went to horse school to learn how to ride a horse. I'm from
Right.
Detroit. There's no stable nearby in
Right.
inner city Detroit, but I learned how to ride a horse in Yosemite Valley in 1996 for the express purpose of being able to tell that story on horseback.
Is there anything that you've done in the past that you wish you could have changed?
The only thing that I wish I could have been better at, I didn't do very well with performing for Oprah Winfrey. When Oprah came here, they wanted me to do my Buffalo Soldier program, and it was possibly the worst performance I've ever given. The problem was that when you're an actor and you're on stage, you're used to people looking at you and engaging with what you're doing. Like, I'm looking at you now, you're looking at me, and that engagement results in this energy and this flow. But when I performed in front of Oprah, in her campsite, the other visitors that were there were paying no attention to me whatsoever, because she's this mega superstar right there. So they're all looking at her. And the thought that killed my performance was this thought. I saw them looking at her, and I'm thinking, well, why am I even here? No one's paying attention to me. And as soon as I had that thought, my performance was just destroyed right there. And if I could do that over again, I would have just said, I'm performing for that camera, for the people who are on the other side of that. But all I was thinking of at the time was the people that was there, because that's what I'm used to as an interpretive ranger, talking to the audience that's right there in front of me. And the audience was not engaged. They were looking at Oprah and engaged with Oprah, because here's this mega celebrity in front of me. And I'm just rambling on, that sort of thing. So I felt that if I could do it all over again, I would like to do that again, have another chance at that. But that's what I learned from that was, often in life, you don't get a second chance. You just have that one chance. You do the best that you can under the circumstances, and then you have to move on. But you asked me.
Yeah, I did.
You asked me. And so if I could go